Few would have believed that the frail, asthmatic little boy who loved to collect insects would amount to anything special, much less the youngest and most robust president in US history. Theodore Roosevelt's transformation from sickly child to master of the bully pulpit and the ultimate symbol of American strength and vitality is an inspiring story of the power of self-determination. In this week's Biographics, we uncover his story. Theodore Roosevelt, the future 26th President of the United States, was born in New York City on October 27, 1858, to Theodore Roosevelt Sr. and Martha Bullock Roosevelt. Roosevelt Sr. was one of the leading citizens of New York City. Theodore Jr., who was known as TD, was the second child to the affluent couple who lived in a luxurious home on Manhattan Island. TD had a sister, Anna, who was 4 years older than him. A younger brother, Elliot, would follow 2 years later. And then there was another sister, Corinne, a year after that. TD suffered from asthma from the age of 3. His condition indeed was so bad that he spent much of his early years in bed. Unable to attend school, his parents hired tutors to teach him from home. Despite his illness, young TD relished the opportunity to learn. Once he had learned how to read, he became a voracious devourer of books. He loved to fill his mind with tales of such Nordic heroes as King Olaf and Eric the Red. He was also fascinated with newspaper stories about the exploits of the famous British explorer, Dr. David Livingstone. TD, he was a dreamer, and he filled his mind with dreams of trekking through uncharted territories and discovering untamed tribes. Young TD showed an unusual curiosity about the natural world. One day, on a trip to the market, he came across a dead seal in a butcher's stall. He was fascinated with the find and returned daily to study and measure it with a ruler. Eventually, he managed to take possession of the seal's skeleton and take it home, where it became the prize exhibit of his Roosevelt Museum of Natural History, which he had set up in his bedroom. From the age of 6, TD began filling his journals with observations about the natural world. His mother regularly took him on trips to the country in order to help alleviate his asthma, and TD made the most of this opportunity to wander around in search of fish, insects, seals, and birds that he could analyze and then write about. The Roosevelt children, they were raised under the norms of Victorian society. As members of the upper class, they didn't mix with the less wealthy, and strict mores of decency were enforced, and manners and politeness were of utmost importance. Sunday night was the day for religious observance, consisting of church followed by quiet contemplation. TD hated Sundays, as this was the day when he was not permitted to indulge in his natural curiosity of the world. In 1869, when he was 10 years old, TD's family embarked on a tour of Europe. For 12 months, the children were exposed to the great sights of England, Germany, France, and Italy. Yet, TD, he was not impressed. He later wrote, "I cordially hated it, as did my younger brother and sister. Practically all the enjoyment we had was in exploring any ruins or mountains when we get away from our elders and in playing in our different hotels." When he was 13, TD's father gave him his first shotgun. He was dismayed to find that he was a terrible shot, which brought ridicule from his peers. When a friend challenged him to hit a billboard in the distance, he discovered the problem, later recalling, "Not only was I unable to read the sign, but I couldn't even see the letters." He was extremely nearsighted, but had never realized it. After telling his father about the problem, he was given a pair of eyeglasses. He wrote in his diary, "I had no idea how beautiful the world was until I got those spectacles." With his improved eyesight, TD was able to become even more obsessive with his nature studies. He learned taxidermy, stuffing and mounting birds that he shot, and adding them to his ever-expanding natural history museum. In the winter of 1870 to 1871, the Roosevelts made a trip to the Mediterranean, visiting Egypt, the Holy Land, Syria, Greece, and Turkey. Unlike the trip to Europe, TD loved this experience. He made the most of the opportunity to shoot exotic birds and then stuff them to take home and add to his collection. When he was 13, TD was sent off to Maine for a solo trip to improve his health. On the train journey north, he found himself in a cabin with some other teenage boys. In the skinny, weak, bespectacled, asthmatic boy, they found an easy mark. They roughed him up, leaving him bruised and humiliated. When he returned home, he told his father about the incident. Roosevelt Sr. told his son that he needed to develop his body physically so that he could defend himself. A prize fighter was hired in order to teach the boy how to box. From this point onward, TD became obsessed with building his body. He began lifting weights, doing calisthenics, and running. He developed a great admiration for those who possessed strength and displayed manly virility. He was also determined to live what he called the strenuous life. The Roosevelts were a family that were driven by goals, and after returning from their trip to the Middle East, they set one for their oldest son, and that was to gain entry to Harvard College in just 3 years. This was a terrific challenge for young TD. He had never gone to school, and although he was skilled in languages, nature, and the classics, he was rather deficient in mathematics. A special tutor was hired, and over the next 2 years, he worked hard to improve his skills. The hard work, it paid off, and in 1875, he passed the Harvard entrance exams. For a freshman at Harvard, the childhood name of TD would never have done, so he took to calling himself Theodore. He immediately took to college life, involving himself in political parades, boxing tournaments, and a rowing competition. He also became a skilled debater, taking on professors and fellow students alike. To his delight, he found himself readily accepted and was soon invited to join some of Harvard's most prestigious societies. Theodore's blissful existence was interrupted during a visit home in his sophomore year. He found that his father was gravely ill. With his beloved TD back home, the old man's health revived somewhat and the danger seemed to have passed. But when Theodore returned to Harvard for the new year, his father took a sharp turn for the worst. Towards the end of February, Theodore received a telegram to return home urgently. He never made it in time. His father died that very night. Theodore was deeply depressed as a result of his father's death. However, he refused to show any of this pain to others. Instigating a pattern that he would continue for the rest of his life, he soldiered on, disciplining his mind and body to do what had to be done. Still, his grief, it was evident in his actions. During a summer vacation to Oyster Bay, he rode his horse to exhaustion. When a dog insisted on chasing the horse, he turned and he shot it. Theodore also began hiking, finding a release in the great outdoors. He teamed with a crusty old adventurer by the name of Bill Sewell, who served as his guide. Sewell later recorded his impression of Theodore Roosevelt at the time, stating, "He was fair-minded, Theodore was, and then he took pains to learn everything. There was nothing beneath his notice. I liked him right off. I liked him clear, though. There wasn't a quality in him I didn't like. He wasn't headlong or aggressive, except when necessary, and as far as I could see, he wasn't a bit cocky, though other folks thought so." By his mid-teens, Theodore had developed into quite a character. Never afraid to express his opinion, he could always be counted on to be the center of attention. His unique outbursts of approval, bully, and delighted quickly became trademark responses. In 1879, he set his charms on a young woman by the name of Alice Lee. "See that girl?" he said to a Harvard pal. "She won't have me, but I'm going to have her." And have her he did. He set out on a campaign to win Alice's heart, leading to their engagement in early 1880. Theodore graduated from Harvard in June of that year, 21st in his class of 160 students. Then, in October, he and Alice were married. After a short honeymoon, Theodore enrolled in a law degree at Columbia University while also working at his uncle's law firm. During his limited leisure time, he decided to learn about the War of 1812. When he couldn't find a decent book on the subject, he decided to write one himself. During the summer of 1881, the young couple took a trip to Europe. While in Switzerland, Theodore left his wife behind while he climbed the Matterhorn. It was during this trip that he decided to forego a legal career. He was determined to set his sights on becoming a politician. Back then, politics was actually seen as being beneath men of wealth, and various friends tried to dissuade Theodore's ambitions. But that was always going to be a losing proposition, and on returning to New York, he joined the Republican Party. Here, he was associating with a class of men that he hadn't previously mixed with, rough men who were skilled in the low blows and dirty tricks of state politics. Roosevelt soon learned their ways, and within months had won the party's nomination for a seat in the New York State Assembly. It was a solid Republican seat, and Roosevelt, he won it handily. Roosevelt turned up to take his seat at the New York State Capitol in Albany on January 22nd, 1882. He cut the figure of a dandy with his fine suit and his upper-crust ways. He was ridiculed by Democrats as well as Republicans. Despite this, he, according to his own recollection, rose like a rocket in New York politics. Roosevelt's politics, they were grounded in self-determination. He firmly believed that each man was in control of his own destiny. But he also realized that the system was grossly unfair, with those with the money and power having all of the opportunities. He made it his goal to bring about a fairer system where all Americans had the opportunity to succeed. When he wasn't working his way up the political ladder in New York, Theodore ventured out west in order to fulfill his love of adventure and the outdoors. In September of 1883, he made an excursion to the Dakota Badlands with the express purpose of bringing home a buffalo head as a trophy. As with most things he set his mind to, he was successful in that goal. During this trip, he also purchased a cattle ranch. In November of 1883, Theodore won his third term to the New York State Assembly. He returned to Albany while his wife, who was heavily pregnant with their first child, went to live with his sister. On February 11th, 1884, he received a long-awaited telegram announcing the birth of a baby girl. But this telegram had also told him that Alice was very sick. He rushed home to discover that the news was even worse. Both his wife and his mother were gravely ill. They both died on the same day, February 14th, 1884. That night he wrote in his diary, "The light has gone from my life." Theodore responded to the double tragedy with the stoicism that epitomized his personality. After a few days of isolation, he left the baby in the care of his sister and returned to Albany to see out his term in the General Assembly. Life had to go on. Throughout 1884, Roosevelt worked tirelessly to propel himself from state to national politics. His brash, unwavering style brought him the attention of prominent men, including an influential Bostonian by the name of Henry Cabot Lodge. By the end of the year, the 25-year-old was being eyed by many as a future Republican leader. However, inside Roosevelt was an empty man. He needed to get away from the rough and tumble of politics in order to heal himself. At the end of 1884, Roosevelt retired from politics and moved to one of his ranches in North Dakota. Theodore Roosevelt turned up to the small Dakota town of Medora dressed in buckskins. He brandished a brand new Winchester rifle as well as a hunting knife that he'd bought from Tiffany's jewelers. He was the quintessential dude and was soon ridiculed by the hardened locals. Despite this, he reveled in life in the West. He displayed a steely courage which impressed all those who came to know him. Roosevelt hired his old tramping guide, Bill Sewell, to come out and manage his ranch for him. But he didn't leave all the hard work to his men. He rode out on the range with them, chased spooked cattle, and stood guard during long and bitterly cold nights. In 1886, he captured a group of thieves who had stolen a boat and then took them as prisoners on a 3-day trek to the local sheriff. During those 3 days, he didn't sleep a wink as he kept his rifle trained on his captives. Following the exceptionally harsh winter of 1886 to 1887, which killed half of his cattle stock, Roosevelt, he returned east. He was 30 pounds heavier than when he left and was a harder, more confident version of himself. Soon after returning, he met up and fell in love with a childhood friend by the name of Edith Caro. They were married on December 2nd, 1886, and would go on to have 5 children together. Roosevelt was soon approached by Republican leaders and urged to re-enter politics. They wanted him to run for mayor of New York. He accepted and campaigned hard despite having little chance of winning. He came in 3rd place with 27% of the vote. Thinking that his political career was over, he next put his efforts into writing the book The Winning of the West. In 1888, Roosevelt gave stump speeches for Republican presidential candidate Benjamin Harrison. When he won the presidency, Harrison was persuaded by Theodore's political champion, Henry Cabot Lodge, to appoint the energetic Roosevelt to the U.S. Civil Service Commission. He took to the role with a vengeance, determined to fight the corrupt spoil system and enforce civil service laws. In 1894, Roosevelt was appointed president of the board of New York City Police Commissioners. He then set about making improvements to the structure of the police force, rooting out corruption and imposing more stringent standards for recruitment. In 1897, again under the urging of Henry Cabot Lodge, new President William McKinley appointed Roosevelt as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He became a strong advocate for the building of the strength of the Navy. When, on February 15, 1898, the U.S. warship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, Roosevelt took it upon himself to order a number of ships to prepare for war. When war was declared a short time later, Roosevelt resigned his post and formed the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. He was determined to be in the thick of the action. The press dubbed Roosevelt's cavalry regiment the Rough Riders. After a period of training in San Antonio, Texas, they were shipped to Cuba. Their first action was at the Battle of Las Guasimas, where they forced the Spanish to abandon their entrenched positions. On July 1, 1898, Roosevelt led his men on the famous charge up Kettle Hill. He was the only man on horseback, making an easy target for the enemy. Still, without any care for his own safety, he rode up and down the line, urging his men up the hill. Also attempting to take the hill were soldiers of the 9th U.S. Cavalry, but these soldiers were having a hard time of it. A reporter for the New York Times recorded the action, stating, "Colonel Roosevelt on horseback broke from the woods behind the line of the 9th and, finding its men lying in his way, shouted, 'If you do not wish to go forward, let my men pass, please.' The junior officers of the 9th with their Negroes instantly sprang into line with the Rough Riders and charged at the blue block house on the right. I speak of Roosevelt first because he was, without doubt, the most conspicuous figure in the charge. Roosevelt, mounted high on horseback and charging the rifle pits at a gallop and quite alone, made you feel that you would like to cheer. He wore on his sombrero a blue polka-dot handkerchief which, as he advanced, floated out straight behind his head like a guidon. Having reached the crest of the hill, Roosevelt dismounted and urged his men to follow him. But there was yet another hill to conquer, and no sooner had the Rough Riders scrambled to the top of Kettle Hill than their dashing colonel set off for San Juan Hill. His men overpowered the Spanish resistance and took possession of both hills. In the process, Roosevelt killed a Spanish trooper who, he said, doubled over like a jackrabbit. Following victory in Cuba, Roosevelt returned to New York, where he was convinced to run for governor. Campaigning vigorously on his war record, he won by just 1% of the popular vote. During his time as governor, he developed the style and platform which would underpin his later presidency. He was a passionate advocate for the rights of the underprivileged, was against large corporations and monopolies, and championed the preservation of natural resources. In 1900, Henry Cabot Lodge and other prominent Republicans urged Roosevelt to throw his hat into the ring for the vacant Republican vice presidential spot in the upcoming presidential elections. Though reluctant, he won the Republican nomination, pairing with President McKinley. With his boundless energy, he threw himself into a barnstorming campaign, making 480 speeches in 23 states. In the end, he and McKinley easily won, and Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as the Vice President of the United States on March 1, 1901. 6 months later, President McKinley was shot while attending the Pan American Exposition in New York. He died 8 days later. As a result, the 42-year-old Roosevelt was propelled into the highest office in the land, becoming the 26th President of the United States on September 14, 1901. He was the youngest man to ever hold the position. Roosevelt was a very different man to William McKinley. Still, he vowed that he would continue to pursue the policies of his predecessor. At the same time, he was determined to stamp his mark on the presidency in order to win a second term in his own right. A large part of the focus of Roosevelt's domestic policies were focused on breaking up the monopolies of big business. He instituted 44 antitrust suits, forcing the breaking up of the Northern Securities Company and putting regulatory controls on Standard Oil. Of all the domestic policies that Roosevelt was passionate about, however, none came close to the preservation of wildlife and the environment. He established the United States Forest Service, created 5 national parks, and placed a total of 230 million acres of land under public protection. In terms of foreign policy, Roosevelt, he was an ardent imperialist. He successfully mediated the Treaty of Portsmouth, which brought an end to the Russo-Japanese War, winning a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. His making of a deal with the Panamanian government for the building of a canal led to the separation of Panama from Colombia in 1903. In the 1904 presidential election, the Democrats put up Alton Brooks Parker to face off against Roosevelt. Campaigning on the promise to give every American a square deal, Roosevelt won 56% of the popular vote, along with 336 of 476 electoral votes. During his second term in office, Roosevelt began moving to the left of his Republican base. He pushed for a number of pretty radical reforms, including the 8-hour workday, most of which they were defeated in the House. He had declared that he would not seek a third term, and so he became a lame duck president. While thoroughly enjoying the role of president, he felt that staying in office for more than 2 terms would run the risk of dictatorship. Following the end of his second term in office in March of 1909, Roosevelt went on an African safari with a group of prominent scientists and hunters. The expedition was on behalf of the Smithsonian Institute and was charged with bringing back specimens for the Institute's museums. The trip was successful and the group came back with 11,400 specimens ranging from insects to elephants. When he returned to the United States, Roosevelt was far from happy with the performance of his successor, William Taft, believing that Taft had made the Republicans far too conservative. He began to speak loudly of leading a program of new nationalism which emphasized labor over capital. By the time that the 1912 presidential election rolled around, Roosevelt was convinced that only he could save the Republican Party. He challenged Taft in the Republican primary. However, Taft won the nomination, squeezing Roosevelt to the sidelines. Undeterred, Roosevelt quit the Republicans, forming his own party, the Progressives, and he ran for president as an independent. He then went to the stumps and appealed to the people. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt was giving a speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when he was struck by an assassin's bullet. This shot was a perfect shot to the heart, and it penetrated his breast pocket and slammed into a thick glasses case. The bullet then thumped into a heavy speech manuscript that he had chosen not to use. Without missing a beat, Roosevelt ensured that the would-be killer was apprehended. Then he went right on with his speech. The first words to the crowd after being hit were, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." The bullet stayed in Roosevelt's pectoral muscle until his death. The 1912 presidential election, it was won by the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson with 42% of the popular vote. However, Roosevelt did beat the incumbent president with 27% compared to 23% for Taft. During a South American expedition in 1913 to 1914, Roosevelt contracted tropical fever after suffering a leg wound which became badly infected. By the time he returned to New York, he was 50 pounds lighter and deathly pale. The last few years were racked with pain for the once robust outdoor adventurer. Malaria bouts were common, as were complications of his leg inflammation. The end came in the very early morning hours of January 6, 1919, after he had complained about not being able to breathe the night before. The doctor was summoned, and after some treatment, he felt better. However, he died in his sleep as a result of a blood clot in the lungs. When he heard of his father's demise, his oldest son Archibald telegraphed his siblings with the words, "The old lion is dead." Theodore Roosevelt, he was 60 years old. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this several times a week. And if you're looking for something else, why not check out some of our videos from the archive that I'm linking to on the screen now. And as always, thank you for watching.